All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to fundamentally shatter this lingering illusion that sleep is just, a passive state of rest. For decades, we've kind of thought of sleep as simply an off switch for the brain, right? Just a time to power down. But as we dig into the converging evidence from molecular biology, neurology, and immunology, we're actually going to see a radically different picture. We're going to explore the deepest mechanisms of human biology to understand why sleep is literally the most intense, biologically demanding, and protective state your body ever enters. So this brings us to a really high-stakes question. What exactly happens to a brain that never truly rests? The reality is pretty stark. A brain deprived of sleep is actively accelerating its own biological aging. We aren't just talking about waking up feeling a bit groggy and needing an extra cup of coffee. No, we're talking about massive molecular and systemic consequences. What exactly happens at the cellular level when we consistently fragment our sleep architecture? Well, to answer that, we really have to look under the hood at the machinery powering our restorative processes. Which brings us to section 1, the myth of passive sleep. The absolutely crucial point to understand here is that the very second your consciousness fades, your brain doesn't just shut off. It initiates this massive, incredibly complex biological cascade to protect itself. It's a highly conserved evolutionary adaptation. Today, we're going to connect the dots between your sleep architecture, your circadian biology, and systemic inflammation to build one unified biological framework. So remember this, when you fall asleep, your brain isn't powering down. It's actually clocking in for the night shift. Let's move into section 2, the brain's glymphatic wash. Now, I want you to think of this as your brain's nocturnal street-sweeping infrastructure. For the longest time, scientists were totally baffled because the brain lacks a traditional lymphatic system. So how does an organ with such massively high metabolic demands clear out its trash? Well, the answer is the glymphatic system. It uses the tiny spaces around your blood vessels as a functional plumbing network. Astrocytes, which are a specific type of glial cell, use microscopic plumbing, specifically these polarized AQP4 water channels, to strictly regulate the exchange of fluid. It creates this incredibly powerful coupling between your central nervous system and your adaptive immune system. This brilliantly illustrates the mechanical fluid dynamics at play here. Because of a massive 3-step convective fluid flow, toxic metabolic byproducts, things like amyloid beta, tau proteins, and alpha-synuclein, are literally forcefully flushed straight out of the brain parenchyma. So first, cerebral spinal fluid flows in along the arteries. Second, it mixes with the interstitial fluid right in the brain tissue. And finally, it washes all that metabolic waste out along the veins. And here's the kicker. When this system fails or gets backed up, these neurotoxic proteins accumulate, actively driving the pathogenesis of neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. But here is a really fascinating part. Why does this massive cleanup primarily happen only when we sleep? Well, it's because of a sudden drop in a neurotransmitter called norepinephrine, which comes from a tiny brain region called the locus coeruleus. When you enter deep, non-rapid eye movement or NREM slow-wave sleep, that norepinephrine goes totally quiet. During the day, it's what keeps you alert, but it also physically restricts this fluid flow. So this nocturnal quiet time, this neuromodulatory quiescence, is exactly what allows your blood vessels to rhythmically pump that cleaning fluid right through your brain tissue. All right, let's zoom out a bit for section 3, circadian clocks and inflammasomes. Now we have to look at the master timekeepers. These inflammasomes are essentially your body's microscopic security system, and their sensitivity is strictly governed by circadian clock genes, specifically one called BMAL1. So the NLRP3 inflammasome is this tiny protein complex inside your immune cells. When it senses danger, it sounds the alarm, activating powerful inflammatory cytokines, specifically interleukin-1 beta and interleukin-18. But, and this is key, the security system doesn't operate at the exact same level all day long. It's intricately tied to the 24-hour cycle of the Earth's rotation, programmed directly by the suprachiasmatic nucleus right in your hypothalamus. Look at this stark contrast. When your biological clock is aligned, that protein BMAL1 keeps inflammation perfectly in check. It flawlessly times your immune readiness. But when it's misaligned by poor sleep, BML1 is suppressed, and that triggers a hyperactive cytokine release. Essentially, if you're chronically sleep-deprived, or maybe you're doing shift work, your immune cells literally lose their sense of time. Without BML1 acting as the manager keeping a lid on things, the NLRP3 inflammasome basically panics. It overreacts to everything and just dumps inflammatory chemicals right into your bloodstream. So, because of things like shift work, improper light exposure late at night, or even erratic feeding times, your biological clock physically breaks down. And that triggers chronic, low-grade systemic inflammation. And this isn't just a localized brain issue, actually. Almost every single tissue in your entire body has its own peripheral clocks. When they decouple from that master clock in your brain, you experience a massive loss of oxidative homeostasis and severe mitochondrial stress. This persistent, non-stop labor against inflammasome-driven inflammation is the exact mechanism leading to metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, and autoimmune pathologies. It is a huge deal. Moving on to Section 4, the inflammatory feedback loop. Let's explore what happens when this whole system enters a state of crisis. It becomes this vicious, bidirectional loop. Sleep loss creates inflammation, and then, get this, that very same inflammation biologically blocks you from getting restorative sleep. Let's trace the causal chain here. You lose sleep. That stress activates a transcription factor called NF-kappa B. Now, NF-kappa B marches into your cell nucleus and commands the massive production of inflammatory cytokines, like IL-6 and TNF-alpha. These molecules then circulate in your blood, reach your central nervous system, and actively suppress your restorative delta brainwaves. So your sleep fragments even further, which causes even more NF-kappa B activation. You are completely trapped in this inflammatory amplification loop. And what you lose in this cycle is absolutely profound. A healthy, uninterrupted sleep architecture perfectly orchestrates a dynamic shift in your immune system. Early in the night, your body ramps up its aggressive first-line defense. That's your Th1 innate immunity. Then, as the night progresses, it dynamically shifts over to a Th2 dominant response. This is what actively builds your long-term immunological memory. When your sleep is cut short or constantly interrupted, this beautifully synchronized neuroimmune choreography is just destroyed. It leaves you highly vulnerable to infections and drastically slows down your recovery time. Now let's escalate the stakes in Section 5, epigenetic aging and senescence. What are the long-term genetic consequences here? Astonishingly, one study found that 78% of differentially methylated DNA positions caused by insufficient sleep are hypomethylated. What does that mean? It proves sleep loss alters your actual genetic expression. Epigenetics is basically the study of how your behaviors and environment change the way your genes work without actually altering the underlying DNA sequence itself. Sleep deprivation actively changes your epigenome. It modifies histones and alters DNA methylation. Literally, just one single night of sleep deprivation can hypermethylate and therefore suppress crucial circadian clock genes like clock and CLOK and CRY1. You are effectively rewriting how your cells read their own operating manual. As you can see mapped out here, chronic insomnia doesn't just make you tired. It definitively, measurably accelerates multiple epigenetic clocks, meaning you are biologically aging faster. Take the Grim Age clock, for example. It's accelerated by changes in specific DNA biomarkers that regulate cellular stress and tissue fibrosis. Or your skin blood clock, which is accelerated through connective tissue degradation. And then consider your telomeres, those little protective caps on the ends of your chromosomes. They physically shorten at a much faster rate simply due to the chronic inflammatory stress and the reactive oxygen species generated by poor sleep. And compounding all of this genetic aging is a massive neuroendocrine failure. Over time, your HPA axis, which is your body's central stress response system, gets so intensely strained that your immune cells actually just stop listening to cortisol. This leaves inflammation completely unchecked, driving systemic metabolic disease. Normally, cortisol acts as an anti-inflammatory brake, right? If you lose one night of sleep, a quick spike in cortisol might buffer the inflammation. But with chronic, ongoing sleep fragmentation, your sympathetic nervous system is constantly firing. Your cells develop glucocorticoid receptor resistance. The brakes entirely fail. This right here is exactly why conditions like rheumatoid arthritis flare up so aggressively in patients with poor sleep. But there is a path forward. Section 6, restoring neuroimmunological alignment. The good news, and it is really good news, is that we can reverse this damage. We can restore the brain's extremely delicate neuroimmunological nexus. By applying these targeted, circadian-based interventions, we can resynchronize our clock genes, reboot that lymphatic wash, and finally silence those inflammasomes. But it requires shifting from just a behavioral view of sleep to a strictly biological one. Things like chronotherapy and optimal light dosing, getting that bright sunlight early in the morning, and fiercely avoiding blue light at night, that literally resets your suprachiasmatic nucleus. Time-restricted eating ensures your peripheral tissue clocks don't decouple from your brain. And therapies like CBTI deeply address the hyperarousal and sympathetic overload that keeps that nasty NF-kappa B inflammatory loop spinning in the first place. The ultimate takeaway of this whole explainer is that treating your sleep as a highly precise biological intervention is the absolute foundation of healthy aging. It's not a luxury, it's not a sign of weakness. It is the fundamental prerequisite for molecular equilibrium. By fiercely protecting our sleep architecture, we allow that locus coeruleus to quiet down. We allow the glymphatic system to flush out the amyloid beta. We allow the BMAL1 gene to suppress the NLRP3 inflammasome. And we allow our epigenome to maintain its youthful expression. It's all connected. This quote brilliantly summarizes the evolutionary importance of sleep. A biological structure for sleep holds significant potential to influence both upstream and downstream prevention for inflammation-related diseases. The science is incredibly, undeniably clear on this point. Whether we're talking about metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, or neurodegeneration, the upstream driver is systemic inflammation. And the ultimate, most powerful downstream regulator of that inflammation is your sleep architecture. It is your primary physiological shield against chronic disease. So I'll leave you with this somewhat provocative thought to consider tonight when you finally turn off the lights. Your brain is about to go to work. But are you giving it the tools it needs? Are you setting the stage for a restorative glymphatic wash? Or are you unwittingly sparking an inflammatory cascade? The choice and the biological consequences are entirely yours.